Welcome to the Beyond the Music podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about Danny Elfman. We're going to go over a quick bio on him, talk a little bit about his process and style when it comes to writing, and then we're going to break down what we think are his top 5 themes. So starting off with part 1, his biography. What were some of the things you found on him, Brian?
So he was born in Los Angeles, California, and he hung out with a lot of the band geeks in high school. He was in a ska band, and the most interesting thing was he dropped out of high school, so he is not formally trained in music.
Right, not in high school, definitely not in the college level if he dropped out in high school. So it's really interesting, and you do hear some different approaches that definitely aren't functional in his music, which is probably a result of
That's
that.
one of my favorite parts about him.
But it's true, right? It makes
his
music
non-functionality
extremely interesting to listen to. So one of the big events in Danny Elfman's life was he started in a band called Oingo Boingo around, which is a great band name.
But
fantastic. He started in this band around 1974 and then played in it until 1995. So even when he was still composing music for films, he was still playing in the band. The only reason he left was because of some hearing issues he was having.
He was saying there was an interview where he would go to concerts and things like that, and he would have a splitting headache that the frequencies of the music would just affect his hearing so bad that he decided to change.
Yeah, and he didn't want to lose his hearing altogether because for his career in film, right, it could be a big issue if he couldn't hear what he was
I would
writing.
think that'd be a hindrance.
I think it would be a problem. But from there, he went on and he scored. One of the first films he scored back when he first started Oingo Boingo was a film called The Forbidden Zone, which was written by his brother, Richard Elfman. And it wasn't like an orchestral score. It was pretty much just his band playing along to the movie. And then from there, he went on to score another movie, which is a little bit of a bigger deal for him.
So he scored Pee-wee's Big Adventure. And when he got the interview for that, he was very unsure of himself. He didn't think he was right for the job. And then he left the interview with the directors and the people who were making the movie, went home and basically wrote some of the main themes that night, put it on what would be like a tape track back then, sent it to the directors. They loved it. He got the job.
Yeah, and then from there, Tim Burton ended up finding him, and he kind of progressed in his career. And with some of the orchestration, like you said, he was nervous, but he had a good friend in his band, the guitarist, who helped him out with some of the orchestration, so that solved some of those issues.
And you see in his career, there's a lot of steps where he'll make career milestones. So the first one was scoring The Forbidden Zone. The next one was where he was on a studio lot in Hollywood just hanging out, and he wandered into Men in Black, where they were shooting a scene with Vincent D'Onofrio. He was just checking out. He wasn't there for any music. Nobody invited him. He was just seeing what was going on. The scene was over. He thought it was cool. He left. Then he got a call from his agent on the way home saying, "You got the job to score Men in Black."
It's funny how just being in the right place at the right time, just someone seeing you or something made him think of that. It's really funny. The last thing we wanted to talk about were some of his influences. Like on The Corpse's Bride, you can hear some influence from some different composers from the 19th century, such as
there's Gilbert and Sullivan,
right,
which was a theater partnership.
Well, let's talk some about his process as well. He uses a lot of repeated intervals throughout a lot of his compositions, sometimes in like a rhythmic way, usually given to the strings or something.
We mentioned Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and the first thing he worked on was this interval motif. It's F sharp to C sharp, this perfect fifth interval. And that's it.
But it's in that really low register, so it kind of gives it a different...
This is the lowest F sharp you can play on the piano. So when you vamp it, you get that quality, and then he plays this circus chromatic theme over top, using those notes. And for one of his first scores, you see a lot of his non-functional, what's interesting.
Yeah, some of his style already showing in some of those scores.
Not, does this make sense functionally, but does it sound good?
And you do see those in other scores, like in Alice's theme and in The Corpse Bride, which we'll get to in a moment. I also wanted to talk some about when he actually goes to record, he records very quickly, and he'll send demos out to whoever's hired him out. But he does a lot of MIDI mock-ups to kind of get an idea of what he's doing to try to, like most composers do. What was he uses the same Vienna Ensemble Pro. Right, and that's the one that Brian uses for some of his stuff. It's really it's a great program to use. So he'll usually get together, a full orchestral sample and then send it off. And then what they'll do is, once it's been okayed and tweaked and such, they'll record the full orchestra. But then he actually goes back in and he doesn't record a whole lot of percussion because he wants to have live strings and brass and such, but he adds in a lot of the percussion himself.
Percussion sounds fantastic on MIDI plugins like Vienna because you always say this, it's just an attack.
Yeah, it's just a struck instrument. Any instrument that's struck, like piano, any sort of drum, those always sound so much better on VSTs, whereas something that's bowed or something that's a wind instrument or plucked or something, those are much more difficult to
One thing I've
recreate.
always admired about Elfman's work is his merging of the two. He'll use technology and classical ways to record something. You see it in Nightmare Before Christmas. There's strings and there's weird sound effects. It's the merging of his styles is one of the reasons why he's so great.
Yeah, he mixes together a lot. You get some like electric stuff in there, which is really noticeable in some, like the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which we'll talk about too. You hear it in there.
The Kingdom uses a lot of electric guitars. Good Will Hunting uses acoustic guitars that use a lot of open strings.
It's really cool. And he still uses some of those string samples too. Like he'll double in pizzicato just so it has a fuller sound along with live recordings. So he does a lot of interesting stuff with the technology side of things.
Alrighty, and now we're on to the good stuff, which is his top 5 themes. And we're going to clarify that these are his top 5 themes or cues, not his soundtracks. And these are not necessarily his most popular works. While the popular ones will probably show up on here, we did what stood out to us, not what was just popular.
Right. So let's start off with number 5. This is Victor's piano solo from The Corpse Bride. And it starts off, this is really neat because it has a very classical sort of influence on it, which is interesting because, he studied a lot of classical music and listened to it over the years. Some of his stuff isn't as influenced like this one is. So you want to talk some about?
Yeah, it begins with these descending minor seconds. And so that was F sharp to G, D sharp to E, and B to C. And those outline a B major chord and a C major chord, which in functional music do not usually go together.
Right. And he did this in another, like I was mentioning Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. He also did this in that one. He had it was a major third he was playing, so just B up to D sharp. But what he did was he kind of had this rhythmic sort of triplet figure where it went, but then he moved it up and down by a half step. Still a major third, which doesn't, again, it's not very functional at all, but here's what it sounded like. It's a very similar sort of concept.
And that's more of the intervals. He's just using major third intervals in interesting ways, going back all the way to Pee-wee's Big Adventure. You mentioned how it's very classical. The chord progression is it's like straight out of the classical era. It's just C sharp minor, B major, and E major.
Right.
And he uses the 5. So if we're in C sharp minor, or if we're in E major, he uses the 5 to go to E major, the tonic, and he uses the 5 to go to C sharp minor as a deceptive
sort of
cadence.
Right.
It's very simple, and that's one of the reasons why it stood out to me.
So moving on to number 4, we have Alice's theme from Alice in Wonderland. One of the first things that stands out when you hear this theme is a rhythmic motif played high by the strings. Let me play that for you real quick.
And again, just a minor third, A to C. It's that interval idea, and then he uses a pedal tone over A. He starts on A minor, then goes to F, and then goes to D major. But he keeps the A pedal tone throughout.
And here's what they sound like when they're put together.
And you see, it's got a Dorian sound when you're using an A Dorian, that A minor. That's during part of, there's like a boys choir singing over top, and it's just kind of vamping between the two. You get very Dorian sound. All right, now we're on to number 3, which is from 2002's Spider-Man, and it's the Spider-Man responsibility theme. You hear it when Spider-Man needs to be a hero and really take responsibility for his action, which is why it's called the responsibility theme.
And it all goes straight back to that talk that he had with Uncle Ben.
Spoiler, he dies, Uncle Ben.
Oh, yeah, in case you didn't know that. But let me go ahead and play a little bit of it for you here. And originally, just so you're aware, the main theme is played by a French horn, and I think it's the only theme in series that's exclusively played by solo French horn, so it kind of stands out and it sort of registers with your memory. So let me go ahead and play that. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening there harmonically. The chord progression is really interesting. It was throwing me off at first. I was trying to analyze it in F major and then making an argument that it modulates or something to like a major 6. It was kind of weird, but I think I ended up discovering that it was mostly borrowed chords that it was using throughout here. It's neat. So if you can borrow from parallel minor, and he does that. I don't know if he was thinking this when he wrote it, but the whole thing, it doesn't start off, it's in A major. But he doesn't initially start with an A major chord. The first chord he plays is actually a flat 6. And he starts the progression on that and then works his way to the A major. So it gives it like this sort of suspenseful feel to it, and it's really effective.
This theme is a great example of if you're not musically trained, just playing whatever you think sounds good. Maybe if he had gone to school, he would have analyzed it a bit different. Maybe the theme comes out a little different. Not that he doesn't know any music, but it's just another example of
when you go through music school, you get that sort of, that style of writing and very functional harmony really ingrained into you, even
like starting a progression on a borrowed chord and not the tonic key.
Yeah, it's not something you would initially think to do. This theme is heard throughout all 3 of the movies, which Danny Elfman didn't compose for the 3rd one, but the themes were still used. But the best time it was used was in Spider-Man 2, where he stops the train and all of the passengers kind of pick him up after
with his arms outstretched.
Yeah, and that scene it plays because like he was basically willing to die to save all those people, and it plays a theme there, and it's one of the best uses of one of Danny Elfman's themes, in my opinion.
That's a great example of using a theme to carry over to different movies to have different meanings. So Responsibility, the first movie is about, Uncle Ben dies and he has to be the hero, and then he deals with things in Spider-Man 2, and it reemerges in different ways but keeps the same idea.
Right, and just shows him growing as a hero as well. All right, number 2 is Charlotte's theme from Charlotte's Web. This theme is, of course, heard when you first meet Charlotte in the movie and Wilbert's talking to her in the barn. It's a very haunting sort of melody, but it matches her, and it has like a timbre of sadness to it, which really matches her character. So you want to play some of that for us, Brian?
Yeah, so it's based around, it's in G, you can analyze it in G major. It's based around this theme. And then there's the second part. The thing that I love about this theme is its simplicity. We've talked a lot about borrowed chords, non-functional chords. In G major, it's just E minor, G major, D major, G major. And together, the theme sounds like this. And if you hear this D major chord, plays a C natural melody, which is a D7. So you get the D major in the left hand and the 7th chord, which resolves down
to the 3rd of the G chord.
So here it is again, and listen for that C melody note. It's got a real nice resolution. It adds that little spice and mystery that I think is what Charlotte's theme is about. All right, so that was number 2. Before we get to number 1, of course, we've got to hit some of the honorable mentions. This is Halloween from Nightmare Before Christmas. It uses a lot of that John Williams technique where you get minor chords in different intervals. Just in different intervals, very effective.
Well, also Edward Scissorhands, which is, it's really a good one. It was, but anyways, this one is a very sad and cold sort of sound to it, and it just does an excellent job of underscoring that particular movie. So we wanted to throw that one in there as well.
The piano duet, again, from The Corpse Bride, a nice haunting melody again. So while we were keeping these to his movie themes, we felt you've got to mention the Simpsons theme.
Right, and it uses a jazz scale called Lydian dominant or Lydian flat 7. It's a really, really interesting kind of unique scale. It's a mode of melodic minor, actually, so it's getting into some kind of advanced sort of theory there. It's really funny. I was listening to an interview with Hans Zimmer, and apparently, I don't think it was with Hans Zimmer, it was one of the musicians that works with him, and apparently Hans Zimmer has this rule that whenever you're working in the studio, whenever you talk about Lydian dominant, you have to call it the cartoon scale. You can't call it Lydian dominant.
I actually like that better. I propose scale? We change it to the cartoon scale.
Okay, all right. Well, that's what we will refer to as it on this show.
From now on. And the last of our honorable mentions is the finale from The Kingdom. A lot of the soundtrack is electronic and string heavy, but this theme is on an electric guitar. It sounds like this. Again, beautiful, unlike Danny Elfman usually writes, and that's one of the reasons why it's on the list. All right, Ian, we are on to number 1. Was it going to be anything else?
All right, so number 1 is Batman. We want to talk about, first off, just how simple this motif is.
It's B, C sharp, D, G, and F sharp. 5 notes. It's another example of memorable theme. Doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to go all over the place. Pick 5 notes and play it in an interesting rhythm. You got yourself a theme.
And there's lots of really interesting chord, like harmony supporting this theme. So it starts off with, really this little motif is outlining just a minor triad.
A B minor triad.
B minor triad. But so it plays that a few times, but it does this really cool transition to a C sharp chord, which I think we talked maybe could be like a 5 of 5.
Yeah.
We're not really sure exactly what it is or what he was thinking when he wrote it. But
if you're thinking B minor, the 5 would be F sharp minor. The chord is C sharp major, which would be a 5 of F sharp minor.
Yeah. But anyways, just listen to how this resolves. It's some good stuff.
Beautiful. Well composed. Look at that. He used 5 notes and 2 chords. He created one of the best melodies in cinema. And
he repeats that throughout the theme, because it does go on. It's a much longer theme than just that. That would be like the main motif sort of deal. But from there it goes on to it speeds up and it becomes more rhythmic. And then it goes through a succession of rapid fire modulations. It starts off modulating up only a minor 7th. So let me play kind of how that goes. Then it goes to A minor. From there it goes to G minor, then G sharp minor, then up to D minor, then back down to G.
Again, there's the minor chords. This is Halloween used it, but minor chords just in intervals, not necessarily functional.
Right. Yeah, it's a lot of direct modulation. But it's really interesting how it works, and it keeps propelling the theme forward and makes it really exciting.
The modulations really stand out to me. You highlighted some of the different chords used. His use of modulation, where it's just a direct modulation, just right into a new key, I love that about him.
And he did kind of, like, he sort of set up like a leading tone almost to go into it, like... And then he went into A, and then played that motif again in A.
So you hear that G sharp.
Anyways, you were saying?
That was F sharp to G. But yeah, you hear that leading tone, and even though it's a new key, your ear wants it to resolve, and it does.
All right, so now we're going to go on to some of our final thoughts. So what were some opinions you had, Brian?
I enjoyed his works a lot more that were the Tim Burton films and the stop motion. I found melodically they were a lot more engaging for me to listen to rather than some of his live action like Good Will Hunting or movies like that. I just found the Tim Burton films very interesting.
Yeah, I liked a lot of his stuff. I really enjoyed some of on the flip side, I enjoyed a lot of the live action ones, especially the Spider-Man one. I know that's actually not your favorite theme in the world.
It's not. A lot of people mention how the main title is one of their favorite Elfman. I don't care for it as much. It doesn't evoke Spider-Man to me.
That's understandable. I think it just, I can see where you're coming from that, but I feel like it does such a good job of supporting the film and underscoring it. But
it's a great score. I prefer Giacchino's Spider-Man Homecoming score. I think
that one's nice because it keeps that iconic sort of, it steals some ideas.
That's more
older themes.
That's more in line of what I was thinking of a Spider-Man soundtrack.
I understand. But they're all good. He has lots of great stuff out there. He's definitely a really interesting composer and has a lot of unique sounds that I think you can learn a lot from just by listening to some of his scores.
And going through this and researching, we've discovered a lot of great themes we didn't even touch on. Probably half of his catalog.
Right. There's so many good things out there. Even from some of the movies that we mentioned, there's other themes in them that are fantastic.
You know, if you're a fan of these, listen to how we played some of the themes and check out the rest of the score and maybe see where else it pops up. And his score is so vast and interesting that it's just great to digest and listen to.
Right. And also his instrumentation too, because we were only playing piano reduction versions of it. But he has some very interesting instrumentations that he does. He uses a lot of vocals, but kind of in strange registers. Like with the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, it has some weird electronic stuff.
Alice in Wonderland uses boys choir. I think it's
a boys choir. Yeah, well, it has something, either boys choir or women's choir or something, and adds like a whole new sort of sound to it. So it's definitely something to check out.
Each time you listen to an Elfman soundtrack, you're not quite sure what you're going to get.
Right. It's always different.
All right, so that wraps it up for today's episode. E and I am excited for next week because we're talking about John Powell's How to Train Your Dragon.
So good. One of my favorite soundtracks.
I can't wait to talk about it. So join us next week, and thank you for listening to the Beyond the Music podcast.